Welcome to the Nut House. The Druids. There are a few reasons why I'm making this video about the Druids. To begin with, the Illuminati still practice Druidism to this day, as mentioned by people like Russ Dizdar and other truthers. So this may help to provide some level of insight into them. Secondly, there is a temptation to many people to connect with the faiths of their ancestors, or to romanticize that, which comes from being prideful. So make no mistake, only Jesus can set you free. And third, because people love the mystery of the unknown. So this should prove to be interesting and hopefully entertaining as well. So let's begin where it all starts. As far as we know, Druidism began in the ancient British Isles. Many people associate the Druids with Stonehenge and other Neolithic sites, but Stonehenge actually predates the Celts, the people who created the Druids, by thousands of years. But I think that the truth is a bit more complicated than that, and I think that what actually led to Druidism is somewhat more nuanced. For example, the Celts and their priestly class, the Druids, once controlled lands from Ireland all the way to Turkey. As a matter of fact, the book Galatians in the Bible was about the Celts. The word Galatian is related to the word Gaul, which was the Celtic name for what is now France. Back then, as I said, France was a Celtic country, and Gaul was the strongest community of the Celts. So many people would assume that Druidism started in Gaul, but Caesar wrote that the Celts actually needed to travel to Britain to be trained as Druids. This implies that Druidism started in Britain. Stories from the Celts about other Stone Age sites, such as New Grange, imply that the Druids understood the spiritual importance of these Stone Age sites. Also, in the Irish Book of Invasions, which described a bit of pseudo-history for Ireland, it described waves of invasions which took place there. And there's a close parallel to this mythical book and the invasions that happened there to the actual invasions of successful peoples that came to the British Isles, including later on the Celts. So, to make a long story short, the Celts themselves were not responsible for sites like Stonehenge, but the secrets to those Stone Age sites must have been passed on to the Celts, who adopted the old ways and mixed with the peoples who had been there before them, which explains why the priestly class of Gaul had to travel to the British Isles to study how to become Druids. The word Druid itself means something like one who knows the oaks, or who has oak wisdom, or something along those lines. The oak tree was sacred to the Druids, and they often conducted their rituals in groves of oak trees. They revered many kinds of trees and used them to form their secret alphabet, Ogham. They have been described as natural philosophers and connected to the people like, for example, Pythagoras, the ancient Greek philosopher, who was secretive and taught that the soul passes on to a new body after death, natural philosophy and more, which was very similar to the philosophy of the Druids. The Druids believed in the transmigration of the soul. They believed that after death, the soul travels to the otherworldly realm, then after a time returns to embodied life, often within the same kin group or land, in an endless cycle of death and rebirth, which has to do with balance. Julius Caesar wrote, "The Druids teach that souls do not perish, but pass after death from one body to another." He noted that this encouraged Celtic warriors to be brave in combat and remove their fear of death. This also reinforced continuity of kin and tribe. Other writers, such as Lucan and Diodorus Siculus, confirm this point. Some more points about this are that honor or shame followed the soul. Insults and satire were feared more than weapons, and oaths carried power beyond death. Satire was used by the Druids to balance their power with that of kings. So praise poetry was highly valued by kings and men of valor, but sarcasm was a powerful weapon when needed. One's honor and reputation was somewhat more important than life or death itself. In somewhat more of a modern context, similar to this fearlessness in Celtic warriors, were the kamikaze pilots of World War II, who purposely crashed their airplanes into American warships for their emperor. So he basically died for the emperor. The Japanese emperor was considered to be a god in Shinto, so that gave them courage. So it's very similar to what the Celts were thinking psychologically. Another example would be Islamic suicide bombers. During the Crusades, there were also Christian knights who fought bravely against overwhelming odds, who considered their plight to be divine. So those are some more examples from other cultures which reflect the mindset that was closest to ancient Celtic warriors, to kind of put you in their brain set. So in this Druidic belief system, at death, the soul would separate from the body. From there, it would enter the Celtic otherworld of Tir na Nog, or the Welsh Annuin. In the Celtic otherworld, a remnant of which remains in Celtic fairy tales, time behaves differently. Some traditions say that when it is winter in our world, it's summer in their world, or a day in the other world can be thousands of years in our world. This brings to mind the phrase a year and a day. Supposedly, everything in this belief system is about balance, which is similar to the storyline in Full Metal Alchemist, where something must be given of equal value to take something created from alchemy. In any event, in the Celtic otherworld, the soul is renewed, taught, and rebalanced. Shape-shifting is also prevalent in the Druidic belief system, which brings to mind a possible similarity to shamanism. The Celtic goddess Morrigan, for example, can shape-shift into other forms, such as a raven. And in the story of Lear, in which a jealous stepmother turns her stepchildren into swans, they are cursed to roam the earth for over 900 years. And there, again, is a story of Tuan MacCarroll, who was also a man who remembered living as a human, a stag, a boar, a hawk, and a salmon before being reborn as a human. Another story related to shape-shifting is the tale of Taliesin. His job was to mix the cauldron of wisdom for the witch Ceridwen. But when a drop of the cauldron's contents burned his thumb, he instinctively put his thumb into his mouth to cool it off and ease the pain. But as soon as he does this, Taliesin inherits the magic of the potion and is imparted with the magical wisdom which was meant for Ceridwen. At this moment, he realizes that her plan was to kill Taliesin all along, as soon as he is no longer needed. So, he becomes a hare, transforms, and tries to run away. But Ceridwen transforms into a greyhound and gives chase. So, Taliesin becomes a fish, and then Ceridwen becomes an otter to chase him. So Taliesin becomes a bird, and she becomes a hawk. Finally, he becomes a grain, and she becomes a hen and devours him. But she gives birth to him again 9 months later. So this story not only illustrates shape-shifting, but the transmigration of the soul as well, and how the soul can enter into the bodies of animals, not just humans, in this transmigration belief system. Another Welsh story is the tale of Mathenwy, where Gwydion and Gilfwy are turned into various pairs of animals as punishment and have to live this way through multiple animal lifetimes. So this is another example of shape-shifting and the transmigration of souls. The story also seems to imply that there may be a connection to cause and effect in this belief system. So in this Druidic doctrine of transmigration, it would seem that you could travel not only from human to human, but from human to animal as well, as previously stated. Well, at this point, we should discuss the other world in the Druidic belief system, known as Annuin in Wales and Tir na Nog in Ireland. So let's start with Annuin. The name means deep or unfathomable. It was a parallel realm of abundance, peace, and timelessness. It was ruled by Arwen, and Annuin was associated with magic, poetry, prophecy, and rebirth. It was located in many places, including across the sea, beneath the hills and mounds, and reached through mist or the in-between times, such as dusk, dawn, and Halloween, just to name a few. In one of the Welsh stories about Annuin, Arwen, the king of Annuin, switches places with Pwyll, a mortal prince, for a year. Another story is called The Spoils of Annuin. In this tale, King Arthur raids Annuin to retrieve a magical cauldron. The cauldron is linked to inspiration, rebirth, and sovereignty. This tale seems to imply a link between the cauldron and the story of the Holy Grail, which came much later. The cauldron will not boil food for cowards. This confirms classical accounts that the Celts did not fear death due to their belief in the transmigration of souls from the otherworld, and where even the otherworld condemned cowardice and rewarded courage. The cauldron's grants reveal inspiration and rebirth. Only 7 people returned from King Arthur's expedition, and the fairy world, like the Celtic otherworld, is very similar. And a new one is the womb of creation, which is similar to the Dagda's cauldron. In fact, that the gift of poetry was one of the gifts of the cauldron connects poetic inspiration with spiritual enlightenment in that system. A remnant of this belief would be kissing the Blarney Stone for the gift of gab, or the gift of poetic inspiration. This brings to mind other connections between the spoken word and spirituality. For example, the word spell, as in to write words letter by letter, or the word spell, as in spell casting. And this all ties into the first tier of the Druids, which was the bards. The Druidic class begins with poetry, or the spoken word. This also brings to mind the Latin-derived word incantation, which contains the word cant, as in to sing, like Canterbury Tales. And let's not forget Genesis, where the Word was God and the universe was spoken into existence. So from that time frame, there are plenty of cultures that have basically corroborate that point of view. So I think you have to kind of understand that in order to really get what they were talking about. So the Druidic order prohibited the written word. So all of their teachings were communicated through the spoken word. This would later evolve into the Fili and the Irish monasteries and their vows of silence. This also led to the development of Ogham, which used notches on a stem to represent their alphabet. The whole system was based upon tree symbolism, where each letter corresponded to one of the divine trees in their sacred grove. One of the interesting things about that is that we, to this day, still associate writing with trees, as that is what books and paper are made from. In any event, Ogham, as a means of conveying secret and sacred information, became codified with positions on the human hand by other means. And so you look at the picture I included, you see an example of that. And we just talked about Anuin, the Welsh version of the Celtic otherworld. So let's take a brief look at the Irish version of the Celtic otherworld, Tir na Nog, which means land of eternal youth. So Tir na Nog is a land of beauty and abundance, eternal youth, joy, music, and feasting. A few days in Tir na Nog, though, can equal centuries in our world. Time works differently in the realm of the fairy tales as well, which prove just one of the many survivals of the beliefs of the Druids. Tir na Nog is usually associated with the Tuatha De Danann, who are the ancient deities of the Celts, which is similar to what Mount Olympus is to the abode of the Greek gods of antiquity. The inhabitants were described as radiantly beautiful and skilled in magic, music, and poetry. And once again, I would add that poetry was considered to be spiritually powerful. It was looked at differently back then than how we view it from a modern perspective. The bards could either use praise poetry to enhance a king's reputation and rule, or satirize them like a curse. So poetry and the word was viewed with more religious awe within the Druidic system. There were several ways in the stories to reach Tir na Nog, such as crossing the sea from the west, or one could ride a sacred white horse, or could also pass through mist, mounds, or portals. Also, one could be invited to this other world by a supernatural being. And it was also a version of the afterlife, which was similar to that of Valhalla. And perhaps the story of Oisin and Niamh is the most famous example of Tir na Nog there is. Niamh, a beautiful fairy woman, falls in love with the Celtic warrior Oisin. So she brings him back to Tir na Nog in the youthful happiness forever. But eventually, Oisin grows homesick and desires to visit the world of the people he missed there and knew once upon a time, just a visit for one day, like a year and a day. So he thinks only a few years have passed as he enjoys himself in Tir na Nog with Niamh. But it has actually been hundreds of years in our time. So Niamh provides Oshin with a magic horse to get him back there and visit the people he once knew, but with only one warning: do not touch the ground. But once again, Oshin arrives on the magic horse back in Ireland. He notices that everything has changed. None of the people he used to know does he recognize there anymore, right? And the local people there were building a church, which he had never seen a church before. The new people were struggling as they tried to lift this large stone to use it in the building. And Oshin, being the kind of person he was, wanted to help out. So he lent a hand from his horse to try to help them lift the stone, which for him was no big deal compared to the people of today. But he lost his balance and fell off the horse. But as he touched the ground, Oshin turned into a frail old man who accepted Christ from the priest and then died on the spot. So in general, the souls of the departed Celts would pass over to the other world of Tir na Nog and other destinations in the afterlife. But remember that the Druids taught about the immortality of the spirit and the belief in the transmigration of souls, in which fallen people would be sent back to the living and start new lives by entering into new bodies. But at times, in between times that is, such as Halloween, which was a time between summer and winter, when the veil was thinnest between our worlds, the spirits of the dead could enter the realm of the living. As previously stated, the Druids believed in the transmigration of the soul. The core idea was that the soul was immortal, mobile, and cyclical, moving through bodies and words as part of a cosmic balance. The soul leaves the body at death, passes through to the other world, and then returns to embodied life, where identity is fluid and memory may persist as talent or fate. And then the soul could return as an animal, and they considered time to be cyclical. Speaking of time, the Druids created the Caligny calendar. The Druids used this to predict many things, including times of the year when the borders between the worlds would be at their thinnest. This was a large bronze calendar that was written in Gaulish. It was created around 200 AD in what is now called France. It shows that the Druids used the lunar calendar to measure ritual time by the moon, seasonal time by the sun, and times marked for cosmic balance. The calendar described is a 5-year solar cycle where each year included 12 lunar months. Intercalary months were added to keep this calendar aligned with the sun, and there were 62 lunar months over the 5-year time span. And there was evidence of advanced astronomical knowledge as well. Each month was labeled as either favorable or unfavorable. Each month was split into 2 halves, the light half and the dark half, and some specific days were marked as lucky, dangerous, or ritually potent. Months were either 29 or 30 days long and were labeled either mat, favorable, or anmat, unfavorable. And in the Druid belief system, every day began at night, not by the day. So more than likely Halloween, or Samhain, as it was called, was the beginning of the Celtic New Year. That said, then more than likely, life began first in the Celtic otherworld. That's where life began, was in the otherworld. And then from there, it moved to our world. So it's kind of backwards. So this would make sense, given that the Celtic gods of the Druids, the Tuatha Dé Danann, are said to have come from the 4 northern islands of the world. The 4 magical treasures of the Tuatha Dé Danann were brought to our world from the 4 islands in the north, which were Faulius, Goris, Findius, and Murius. From Faulius was brought the Stone of Destiny, which would scream whenever the true king were to step on it. From Gorius was brought the Spear of Lu, and from Findius was brought the Sword of Noada, and from Urius was brought the Cauldron of the Dagda, which was said to bring the dead back to life. A quick side note from the Cauldron from Urius. Cauldrons in Druidic lore could often restore the dead to life, but they would lose their power of speech, which to me symbolizes that the souls who are brought back to life in new bodies via the transmigration of the soul would forget their previous lives. And one of the panels of the Celtic Gunderstrup cauldron seemed to display fallen warriors dunked back into the cauldron and brought back to life, which seems to corroborate this point. This cauldron was found in a Danish bog. We will visit this line of thought later when we talk about the bog bodies. But before we move on from our discussion of Celtic cauldrons, perhaps the witches' association with cauldrons is a residual example of the Druids. Cauldrons were also linked to the prosperity of the land and fertility. These stories of old became transformed into the myths of King Arthur and the Holy Grail, where only the Grail or cauldron could heal the lost fertility of the land. In any event, Druidic gods of the Tuatha Dé Danann came from the islands of the north first. The north is associated with darkness, just like Halloween, so Celtic days began with the night first. The year began with the night first, and even the gods began with darkness first. It is possible that the islands of the north are a metaphor for the stars, but that would be purely subjective on my part. But either way, after the Tuatha Dé Danann left the 4 islands of the north, they traveled in the clouds until they reached our world, so perhaps their true origin was indeed in the sky. So this would be a good time to talk about Druid cosmology, or the myths regarding how this world was originally created. Since the Druids left nothing in writing, we can only hypothesize based upon what we know. Well, other than the Book of Invasions, there is not a whole lot to go by other than the Fomorians, the Firbolg, and the Tuatha Dé Danann, those 3 groups of people. But knowing the Celtic oath of swearing by land, air, and sea, then the 3 greatest groups of antiquity would possibly be related to this as well. For example, the Tuatha Dé Danann perhaps ruled the sky because they entered in the clouds. The Fomorian were one-eyed monsters that ruled the sea. And last but not least, the Firbolgs carried bags of dirt to bury the land. But my hunch tells me that the Fomorians and the Firbolgs were a bit like the Titans of Greek mythology, or the Viking mythology of the Aesir versus the Vanir. And one can speculate that the waters of life were poured upon the earth from the great darkness cauldron to create existence in itself, in a hypothetical cosmological story. The Stone of Destiny would have created the land, and other treasures from the 4 islands, such as the spear and sword, would have created the rest of this worldly dimension. But this is all really just pure speculation on my part, as the truth on all of this goes back to what likely would remain a mystery, as the Druids left no formal writing. But all of this remains purely speculative on my part, as the Druids left nothing in writing, and so it all falls down to the mysteries of time, describing what exactly they did believe in. Now, before we move on from talking about the Fomorians, who are a bit like the Vanir or Titans of the Sea, I want to tell you a quick version of the story of the Celtic deity Lugh. His mother's name was Enya, which humorously enough means nut. Anyway, Enya's father was a one-eyed Fomorian giant named Balor, who used his fleet of ships to terrorize and raid the peoples along the coast. He lived in a brutal castle on an island in the rough seas. There was a prophecy that his grandson would end up killing him. So Balor kept his daughter Enya trapped in a crystal tower in the castle on his island. But Cian, a member of the Tuatha Dé Danann, discovered her dark beauty. So with the help of a druid, magic was used to help him gain access to Enya in her crystal tower, and they both fell in love with each other. But not long after that, Enya gave birth to triplets. Balor found out and tossed 2 of them into the sea, where they died instantly. But rather than watch her last child die in front of her like the rest, Enya clutched her last baby to her bosom, and there she flung herself into the sea, protecting him as she fell. She sacrificed her own body to protect her last child as long as she could. She sacrificed her own body and life to protect her last child as long as she could. But the frigid cold of the ocean was too much for her, and she died as she handed off the child to the druid who had brought Cian by ship to this island, and who named the child Lugh. And the druid brought him back to Scotland and raised him by a foster mother, where he was trained in all the arts. His identity, the child that is, remained secret, because if the one-eyed Fomorian king Balor ever found out, he would seek out the boy and have him killed. But for now, Balor just assumed the boy was dead. But the druid, who was aware of the boy's fate, had trained him since birth in all the arts, including poetry, the harp, and war. After Lu became of age, he was finally allowed to travel to the king's castle due to his unique mastery of all the arts. He was put through rigorous tests to prove his skills and prove his royal lineage, and now the time had come to reveal who he was. The Fomorians were demanding a tribute from the Tuatha De Danann, who were taxed beyond their means, so they were about to go to war. And this was to be the celebration of all the courage of Celtic warriors, knowing many of them would go to war and never return. And with everyone gathered in the great halls of the king, right before they were to be served their ritual last cup of mead, the Celtic king Nuada asked Lu to provide his lineage to him in front of everyone in the hall, to which he revealed that he was the one who was destined to kill Balor. So he was ceremoniously handed the symbolic first cup of mead and all the honor that goes with that, and proclaimed to be coronated as the temporary High King of Ireland. Later in the story, Lu went on to decapitate the one-eyed Balor with his spear, thus fulfilling his prophecy with the spear, which was one of the 4 treasures of the Tuatha De Danann. Then he was to lead a party to follow the retreating Fomorians across the frigid sea to their cold island castle in the west and recover all of the items that were ever stolen from them from the Tuatha De Danann over the years, including the Dagda's harp, which strings could control the weather. Let me say that again. The Dagda's harp was able to control the weather, which brings to mind HAARP today, which the CIA allegedly uses for weather control today. So that's just one more example of how the Illuminati is using Druidic teachings. So HAARP, as a weather control agency controlled by the CIA, obviously goes back to Druidism in that story, which shows yet another tie to ancient Druidism today. And the story ends with the Fomorians revealing the secrets of agriculture, which are to plow, seed, and reap on Tuesday, which of course is symbolic. Since Tuesday is considered the day for the Roman god Mars, then there must be some symbolic link here between war and agriculture, one can presume. But if you fast forward to modern Ireland, where lightning storms are said to be Lu and Balor fighting in the sky, that would imply that Lu's spear was actually a metaphor for lightning. This seems to suggest that he was a bit like a version of Thor, but the Romans associated him with Mercury, just like they did Odin. But who knows? One of the beauties of Celtic myth and legend is the unsolved mystery behind it all, but I digress. In any event, one of the things this story tells us about the Druids was that they believed in fate. Balor could not escape his fate any more than Lu could. The idea that nobody can escape their destiny is very Celtic, just like the idea that nobody can escape the love that they are destined for, hence Enya. This idea of fate brings us to the Druidic belief in Geis. Geis is like a rule that is placed on a person. The idea of fate brings us to the Druidic belief in Geis. Geis is like a rule that is placed on a person that must be obeyed. It's tied to honor and identity and carries inevitable consequences if broken. Examples of Geis prohibitions are: you must never eat the meat of a specific kind of animal, you must never refuse hospitality, or you must never travel alone at night. But each Geis is personal to one person, so they're not the same between different people. People have their own individual Geis, according to that system. But there are also Geis obligations, like you must always accept a challenge, you must protect guests under your roof, or you must never refuse a request from a woman. And many heroes in Celtic stories have multiple conflicting Geis, which lead to their ultimate demise by fate. Geis could arise at birth, or it could be imposed by Druids. Also, the satire of bards or the Fili itself could bind fate. Supernatural beings can impose Geis on people. Cuchulainn, whose name means the Hound of Cu, like Cujo means the Hound of Joe, from Celtic myth had 2 Geis. He must never eat dog meat, and he must never refuse hospitality. An enemy of his offered him dog meat as a guest, and because either way he breaks the Geis, his doom becomes unavoidable. In the story of Deirdre, a loyal knight to the king is sent to retrieve Deirdre and bring her back to the king so he can marry her. But Deirdre reminds this knight of his Geis of hospitality, and forces the knight to kiss her, which seals their fate with the king. And there are similar stories throughout Celtic mythology of the same kind of love triangles like that, like Lancelot, Arthur, and Guinevere, etc. Speaking of fate, the washer at the ford cleans the bloody clothing of those who are about to die in battle. The hero Cuchulainn ran into her and asked her whose bloody clothes she was washing, to which she replied, "Don't you recognize your own clothing?" She may be related to the banshee, who screams as she heralds the death of a loved one. Ban means woman, and she means fairy, so her name literally means the fairy woman. Fate awaits the living to join their lost friends and family in the Celtic otherworld. The silver apple branch is a druidic wand of the otherworld, and apples are associated with the land of the dead. For example, bobbing for apples at Halloween may come from Rome, but the association with apples is something that both cultures had in common. And when King Arthur is close to death, he is taken by boat to the island of Avalon to have his deadly wounds healed. Avalon itself means orchard of apples, and there was a legend that once Britain needed him again, that once again he would rise and return. And there was a legend that once Britain needed King Arthur again, that he would one day rise again and return. This is another example of the Druidic belief in the transmigration of the soul. And the love triangle, common to Celtic myth of Arthur, Guinevere, and Lancelot, is yet another example of the Druidic reverence for the number 3. So the Druids also believed in the sacredness of the number 3, such as father, mother, child, past, present, future, birth, life, death, body, soul, spirit. The Druidic oath was split into 3. May the land rise up against me, may the sea swallow me, and may the sky fall upon me if I speak falsely. So, initiating cosmic retaliation makes the oath irreversible. The Druids also believed that many of their deities were 3 in one God. The similarity in this to the Trinity may be why so many Irish pagans were easily swayed to Christianity by St. Patrick and his use of the shamrock. An example of this is the goddess Morrigan, an example of 3, who is often portrayed as 3 separate beings. There are prophecies attributed to Morrigan, so she may be related to the Norns or the Fates of Greek mythology. A great example of this is the 3 witches in Macbeth. Bridget is also portrayed as 3 goddesses all rolled into one. There are also statues of Lugh which show him with 3 heads, and don't forget that he was born as triplets. There's also something called the Brehon Law. The Brehons came from the Druids. That's what they evolved into, is the Brehons. Brehon Law, which I have read, is likened to Druidism and codifies rules in 3s, like 3 witnesses are required for a legal claim, or 3 fines must be imposed for certain offenses. So the Brehon Law was also linked to the number 3. The Druidic order itself has 3 levels. Bards, who are the poets, Ovates, who are like the seers or fortune tellers, and Druids, the philosopher priests. The bards could elevate kings with praise poetry or curse them with satire. The Ovates were diviners, healers, and charm interpreters, and they could read the omens of birds, etc., and dreams. The Druids were judges, which later became, like I said, the Brehons. They presided over sacrifices, and they were mediators between men and gods, and they were advisors to the kings. Kind of like Merlin and King Arthur, how Merlin would advise King Arthur. Then there was also Felids and Bards, the last extension of the Druids of the 3 stations, composed in triads to reinforce, to memorize, and to empower. In fact, there is a whole book on the subject of the triads of the Bards called the Triads of Britain. And triads also have magical principles within that Druidic system. 3-fold curses and blessings can be found in the Carmina Gadelica. The charms of the Carmina Gadelica are triadic in structure and are meant to be recited at doorways or gates or while walking around the house 3 times. An example of a charm in English would be something like this: I bless this well, this stream, this water, and all that comes out of it. by the land, by the sea, by the sky, by the mountains, by the stone, by the tree. Let no harm come to me, to my cattle, to my house. By night or by day, may no ill befall through water or wind, through beasts or men, through spirits or unseen powers. So the triplets in there go all the way back to Druidism. In any event, let's take a look at some ancient rituals of the Druids, starting with the ritual of cutting down mistletoe. According to Pliny, on the 6th day of the new moon, Druids in white robes would climb an oak tree and cut down mistletoe with a golden sickle. The mistletoe dropped down from above into white cloth and was never allowed to touch the ground. So below them stood 2 white bulls who had never been yoked, with their horns tied together, and the bulls were immediately sacrificed afterward. The mistletoe was called the all-heal and was believed to cure infertility, act as an antidote to poison, and bring a divine blessing. Mistletoe was sacred because it was evergreen, and it grows in between the earth and the sky. The oak tree was also divine to the Druids, so the combination of mistletoe and the oak tree made it extra sacred to them. Another Druid ritual involving a bull was the tarfesh, or bull sacrifice ceremony. A bull was sacrificed and a chosen man drank its blood. He would then go to sleep wrapped in its hide and chewing on the meat of the bull, as 4 Druids read incantations over him. In his dreams, he would see who would become the next king. Then there is the sacred fire ritual of Beltane, aka May Day. On this night, all the house fires were extinguished across the whole land, and a single bonfire was lit, and then kindles in a ritually pure way. The new flames lit from this central fire and taken from the one central fire to relight every hearth in the land. This had to be relit via friction, such as rubbing sticks together using 9 sacred words. And the number 9 in this may be symbolic of the 9 months it takes for a woman to give birth. So it's kind of like they were giving birth to the flame. The bonfire would be created on a hilltop. So basically all the fires would be put out in the whole country. Then what would happen is on one hilltop, the Druids would light a new fire by friction. So by rubbing sticks together, something along those lines. And then once that bonfire is lit, then the people would use it to light their own fires to bring it back to their own hearths and then light the whole country up again. And speaking of fire, let's talk about the goddess of the Druids, Bridget. Among other things, she was a protector of the hearth and home, and her fire was sacred to her. So dedicated priestesses kept an eternal flame burning continually in her honor in a sacred grove in Kildare. The Celts often practiced sending children to foster parents to strengthen bonds among clan members and for other reasons. And we already looked at how 9 sacred woods were used to rekindle the sacred fire. So perhaps Bridget was the foster mother of fire itself. Another fire ritual involved driving cattle through 2 bonfires to purify them. Smoke was believed to ward off disease and harmful spirits, perhaps similar to burning sage. But people sometimes jumped over the fires or passed through the smoke. In Scotland, people were given seasonal muffins, where one of them had a burn mark on the bottom. Similar to pulling out the shortest straw, people have speculated that this was a remnant of the ritual of picking out sacrificial victims for the Druids. And speaking of fire and sacrificial victims, this leads us to the Wicker Man Druidic ritual. According to Julius Caesar, the Druids built large human-shaped figures of wicker. Then they filled them with living people, preferably criminals, and then they were set on fire as offerings to the gods. Based upon what I know about the same ritual being used later with live animals in later France, then this ritual would have been conducted on midsummer, also called the summer solstice. Perhaps it had to do with restoring balance to the dying sun as the days began to shorten from here on to the rest of the year. And that leads us to the practice of threefold ritual human sacrifice. Evidence has been found in peat bogs for sacrificial victims. These victims had traces of the triple death, which is ritualistic. In the case of Lindo Man, he suffered a blow to the head, strangulation, and his throat was cut. So he died in 3 different ways. So some of the victims had traces of mistletoe inside of them. And the fact that they were deposited into peat bogs suggests that they may have been trying to directly send them to the Celtic otherworld. And speaking of the other world, wells and springs were seen as pathways to the other world or for water spirits such as the Lady of the Lake in Arthurian legends. People today still venerate sacred wells that have been re-sanctified by the church to repurpose them for saints from their Druidic origins. Today, visitors still leave coins, candles, and ribbons tied to trees overlooking these wells. These offerings are made in the hopes of healing or for other concerns, as many of these wells are said to have curative powers. So to wrap this up, Ruz Dizdar and other truthers have stated multiple times that the Illuminati still speak of the old languages of the Druids and conduct their secret rituals to this day. So the question that nobody is asking is why? Why? What are they getting out of this? And while I'm sure there are multiple reasons, fate awaits the living to join their lost friends. And if anyone has their own thoughts on this subject, I hope you can share them with everyone so we can all learn from you. But my hunch is that the most important reason why they still refer to the rituals of the Druids is that the elite's biggest priority would have to be looking for a way to escape the judgment. So possibly they have retained the ritual to control what they believe to be the transmigration of the soul. Perhaps they practice on clones, I don't know. But there are sure a lot of predictive programming in movies on this subject. But alas, this is but speculation on my part. Anyway, I thank you all for watching. Don't let pride draw you into these old religions. The only truth comes from Jesus Christ, and God bless you all in Jesus' name.
Don't forget to like, share, subscribe, and leave a comment. Thank you.